If someone told me that there is the easiest trick with which I can take photos that are up to twice or even 3 times as sharp as usual, I would have never believed that. But after years of wildlife photography struggles, I now know that it's true. Especially in the beginning, I've made all the mistakes in wildlife photography that you can do. But I don't regret one of those mistakes, as I got from these shots to these shots. And through my mistakes, I learned so much that I can now confidently say that I'm able to take great shots of any animal around in any situation, and I can now break it down to my top 10 most important tips from gear and settings over mastering in the field techniques, so we can shorten your learning curve a lot and you can take much better shots at the very next time. And towards the end, you will find out about that crazy sharpness trick. Tip number 1 is about your gear. And I'm saying your gear for a reason. I will not tell you what gear you'll have to buy to get perfect results. You absolutely don't need the best and most expensive, up-to-date gear to enjoy your wildlife photography. Of course it helps, but to get a feeling for this kind of photography and improve your skills in the beginning, or also as an advanced photographer, it's absolutely worthless. I've said it before, work with what you have. Get out, develop your skills, and when your gear limits your skills, then you can slowly upgrade. But when you're not able to take good shots with budget gear, the pro gear will not change anything. In fact, when I started with my mother's Sony A6000 and a 55 to 210 millimeters kit lens. And you know what? For my level at this point, I was able to get some really good shots. But what's worth far more is that I've learned so much about cameras and animals during my first months that my motivation to improve was so on top. As I got to a point where I could not improve the image quality because of mainly the lens's poor sharpness, my grandfather, which is a nature photographer himself, lent me a good old Canon 7D and a 300 f4 lens from, I think, 1991. So a more than 30-year-old lens, and I could immediately see the difference, but still there was no need to buy a crazy camera in the, let's say, 600 f4 lens. For example, with that old 300 f4, I was forced to learn to get closer to animals. And I can tell I've had so much fun. I had amazing wildlife encounters and took some amazing shots. It was all about the process, and that's what I want to share with you. Focus on the joy of photography. And that's definitely not buying expensive gear just because pros take amazing images with their setups. Of course I upgraded over time, but I'm still not using pro gear as the priority still lies on exploring and having fun with nature and the wildlife that surrounds us. One thing I've also learned during this time is something that I see a lot of people do, and that's also the next tip. Don't buy unnecessary accessories. You just need a camera, a lens, some batteries and the right memory cards, which we will talk about in a moment. The best example for unnecessary gear are UV filters in front of your lens. My grandfather had a filter mounted on the 300 f4 for lens glass protection too, and even the quality was much better than I was used to with the Sony kit lens. I was somehow still not 100% satisfied with the image's look. At some day I walked through a muddy area and I accidentally got mud on the front element. As I took the filter off and continued shooting, I immediately got better images. I could even see the difference on the small camera display. And I could see it clearly. It was a 10% image quality improvement at least. And the filter that was mounted was not even a cheap one. Now I know many of you are scared of scratching your lens's front element. And that's fair enough. But you can also just use your lens hood. It provides all the protection you need. I've never used any sort of filter since then and never scratched the front element. And this also goes for the lens cap. I have never used the cap while I was out in the field since I owned this 200 to 600, and my glass is in perfect condition. I think it's just super annoying to attach and detach the cap all the time when you're in the field. You don't have the time to do so sometimes. And I think it's much more dangerous for the front element to reach in that big hole trying to find the right place to fit the lens cap. One wrong movement in there when attaching it, and I think that's when your lens can get scratched. Right now, at the time where I make this video, it's November, so winter is just around the corner. In fact, it might already be here because it's 5 degrees out and it's freaking cold. And when you go out in these conditions and it's very cold, you may have noticed that your battery's life is going down. That's because cold batteries don't hold the charge very well. So it's always a good idea to bring even more extra batteries in cold weather and put those in your warm pants pocket so that they don't get that cold. And when they got cold in your camera, when you were walking around or shooting, and they're getting low on charge, change them in time and put the almost empty batteries in your pocket pants again. By doing so, they will warm up again, and in the end, you'll be able to put them in the camera again and squeeze out some extra shots. Now, let's talk about some settings and in-the-field tips. The next tip is about your image quality settings. We can select JPEG or RAW in our cameras. And because RAW seems too difficult, most of us shoot JPEGs. And that's a big mistake, because those RAW files will capture way more details. For example, in post-processing you can change the white balance, you can recover shadows and highlights, which in some situations is so important. RAW files just have so much more data. Let's have a look. I took this tricky shot of an avocet in spring, and as you can see I had a real challenge here because the water in the back was so bright because of the backlight that I had to underexpose a lot. But now the dark parts of the bird are almost black and you can see no details. But because I shot in RAW, I can go into an editing software like Adobe Lightroom in this case, and I can increase the shadows and recover a lot of details. The same goes for the highlights, as you can see here. Now here's the final image, and I think I would have never gotten this result with a JPEG. So with RAW, we have so much more flexibility and versatility to get our images out of the camera to a whole new level after editing. Tip number 5 is about your shooting mode, or let's say your burst rate. We can either take one photo at a time, or we can take photos continuously. The burst rate at which we take photos is called FPS, or frames per second. We want to shoot in a continuous, there's a heron flying. We want to shoot in a continuous mode with the highest frame rate we can set. The result is we're getting a lot more shots and the chance of getting good shots is much higher. So this is my Sony a7 IV, and you can hear that by setting my FPS from single shot to a continuous shooting mode, we can take multiple shots by just holding the trigger. When I now set this burst mode to the highest frame rate, you can hear how many photos we can take in a short period of time. By that we higher the chances massively to get a sharp shot or to get the one shot that we want out of every moment, just as I did in this situation with a hunting egret. However, there is a downside to shooting with high frame rates. You just have a lot of photos to go through at home, and you might also have an issue with the buffer. The buffer on your camera is how many images it can store while shooting. Let's have a listen to what happens and how quickly this camera goes to the buffer limit. So we are shooting in the highest frame rate. As you can hear, it gets a lot slower over time as the buffer limit is reached. And that's not ideal. What we can do is we can change the speed at that we shoot to not reach this limit. But if you still want to shoot the highest frame rate, which I would recommend, you have to learn to work with that buffer. You can avoid reaching the limit by shooting bursts, and even better, by learning about your target's behavior, you can narrow down to only shooting the important moments and don't waste shots before and hit the buffer in the moment when it gets very important. Now there actually is another way to make your buffer longer and allow you to shoot longer at higher frame rates. And that's my next tip. Don't save money at the wrong end. And this goes especially for memory cards. The speed of your memory card when it's writing down the data that you capture defines your buffer limit. At this point, when you buy a new card, be careful with the speed information on the cards. Oftentimes, manufacturers only show their reading speed on the front, not the writing speed. So let's have a look at two different cards with different writing speeds. Right here we have a standard SD card with 200 megabytes of writing speed. So let's have a look at when the buffer limit is reached. Now we are going to do the same with a card that has a much higher writing speed. As you can hear, the buffer limit is not even there anymore. I can shoot and shoot and shoot and it does not stop. So as you can see, it makes a huge difference that can decide whether you're set for the perfect moment or not, because your buffer limit is already reached. So my advice would be to get the biggest but primarily fastest cards you can afford, rather than buying cheaper ones, letting you think you save money, but in the end you'll pay twice or more when you have to switch to faster ones. What you have to do to find out what card is the best for your camera with the best writing speed, just Google your camera model and the best card writing speed for it. The next and one of the most important tips is to shoot in the continuous autofocus mode. I see people doing that wrong all the time. In fact, this morning I helped a woman over here at the lake to fix her focus problem as she was complaining over never getting sharp images. That was because she was in one-shot mode. And what that does is when we aim at our animal and hold down the focus button, it will focus and it will give us a signal to confirm focus. Whether your focus field will appear green or red, or no, red is I think when it can't find focus, and green is when it finds focus. Now what happens when the animal moves or we move closer or further away from the subject, we have to manually refocus every time. What I mean with manually refocusing is not turning the focus ring, but refocusing by pressing the focus button again and again and again when the subject is still moving or we move. With every movement we do in the distance to the animal or the animal comes closer, we always have to refocus by pushing the button again. If you don't, your subject will be out of focus. Thankfully, modern cameras have a continuous autofocus mode. On Canon it's called AI Servo, and on Nikon and Sony I think it's called AFC. This is a game changer when it comes to getting a lot of sharp photos of moving animals. In this case, especially with birds that move around a lot. When we are out in the field, it is so important to understand how the background and the foreground influence your images. Most of the photographs you see online will have super blurry backgrounds and the subject are absolutely isolated. You might wonder how it's done, and I can tell it's actually not that hard. But before I tell you how it can be done, I have to mention that there is a train coming and we have to wait. I have to mention that you don't always need these super close, blurry background shots. Most of the times, these shots do not tell a story that brings our images to life. And that's my next tip. By playing around, you have to learn how your environment can create different scenes and looks. Sometimes it's so much better to not get super close. Rather try to put the environment in the shot to create a scene and tell more of a story. And related to this, another tip is to learn how to position you and your camera to create different looks and styles through perspective. Now we can combine getting blurry backgrounds and perspective adjustments in the following example. What you have to do in order to get these blurry shots is primarily get to eye level. You might have heard about that before, and that's because it's just so important. I have two example images here. In the first shot, I'm standing and shooting down on this friendly dunlin. It's surrounded by that ugly, soily ground and it just doesn't look nice. In the second shot, I went all the way down to eye level and you can immediately see how the background changes by just changing your position. The background is not even there anymore. So with every centimeter you go down lower to this eye level, the blur increases as the ground gets more out of focus with the distance. And as we talk about distance, the next step to make this effect even stronger is by getting closer to your subject. In this video you can see how close I am now to the animal, and in the photos you can see how the background disappears completely. Here is another example with a ringed plover. Here you can see the ringed plover, and here you can see how I photographed it. So I got close, went down to eye level, and I eliminated the background and isolated the bird. Sounds not that difficult, right? In some cases, of course, birds will not tolerate you like the dunlin or the plover did and keep a safe distance to you. Now, as it can be very hard or even impossible in some situations to get this close without camouflage or a hide, my tip is to just accept the distance and put more of the environment in the frame and start to play with it. This includes background elements as well as foreground elements. Now I took this shot of the dunlin from a much bigger distance and I put some stones in the foreground to display how you can show the animal in its environment. So you don't need to be crazy close, and by that you can play around with your position and create a composition with the surroundings so you create more of a scene even better because of the bigger distance and the animal will not get scared that easy. Now to have the opportunity to play around with close-ups and different kinds of shots, we have to have a look at the location. Because some locations are just easier than others. There is locations that you have been told about or found in the internet that they say is great to photograph. But most of the time you have to visit these locations on your own. I recently went to an island in the Netherlands that I've never visited before, and they all said it's absolutely brilliant for photography and especially for bird photography, and there have actually been some reports of cool birds during this time, so I went there. In the beginning of my photography, I would have grabbed my camera and tried to get the shots at the spots that I've been told about. Now if I did so, on this island I would have never gotten any photo. Today I know that I can't trust these tips that much, so on the first day I grabbed my bike and I went out with the binoculars to scout spots and areas that fit my style of photography. What I found was that 90% of the spots that I've been told were so bad. The birds were extremely far away, and even if I got 3 to 4 times closer, it still would have been not nice to photograph at all. It took me 3 whole days of scouting until I found the perfect spot on my own and I could finally photograph the way that I wanted, and that's also when I got these beautiful shots. In general, a good tip for the beginning is to always go for areas where the animals are used to humans, like a town park or for water birds, the park pond, for example. You're almost guaranteed to get the shots there. The last tip is about camera settings, because before you hit the trigger, you have to make sure that your settings are correct. If you're new to photography, you might be scared of shooting in manual mode, and that's absolutely okay. One of the automatic modes is perfectly fine for the beginning. You can start with shooting in shutter priority, or I think it's called TV on your camera. Shutter priority will make you pick the shutter speed and the camera picks the rest of the settings. I recommend starting with about 1/1000th of a second, because that will ensure that your speed is high enough to freeze the motion of moving animals. When the subject is not moving, you can of course lower the shutter speed, or when you have very fast moving action, you can make the shutter speed faster. Now, if you want to hear it or not, the much better opinion is still to shoot in manual mode. But you can pair that with automatic ISO. It is my absolute favorite technique. And you can make it even better by working with exposure compensation. Sounds complicated? In the end, it will just be one dial that has to be turned to expose the photo how you like it, and you'll never get to the point where you find that your photos still are too dark or bright. For me, these are the perfect, all the time, all around wildlife settings. I will not go into detail now, as you can find the full guide to it over here. Make sure to check this setup out, because a lot of photographers trust in these settings because they're just brilliant. And lastly, the bonus tip that can double or even triple your sharpness. And that is because the aperture of your lens has a huge effect on the sharpness of your shot. You can check that by taking photos with different apertures of a well-lit subject with some detail on it. It can be a piece of paper with text that you attach to a wall. Then go to manual mode, pick a shutter speed of, let's say, 1/200th of a second when you're on a tripod, or 1/1000th of a second when hand holding. Then put your ISO on automatic, and then you go from your lowest aperture, like 6.3 on my lens, to f7.1, f8, and so on. By that, I found that my lens is twice as sharp at f7.1. That's just a small step from 6.3 to 7.1. So it still has a wide aperture that lets in tons of light, which is enough for almost any situations, but it's a lot sharper. It's just so easy, and it makes such a huge difference. You have to try that out.